one of our API keys from a Tor network, they will cut what's called a Sev2 ticket, which is our second to highest level ticket to us. And then I think that eventually gets the manager's attention. Anyways, they are watching for all this stuff, just so you know.
Can you do these tests through GuardDuty, or are you using some other tool?
So I'm usually using an EC2 instance or my own laptop, depending on the attack. But I'm going to talk about these two particular attacks that you can easily do yourself. All right. So while we were doing the live action demo, I launched that CloudFormation template. It launched 3 instances. 2 instances we call the compromised instance, and 1 is called the malicious instance. This particular finding, you can see, says unauthorized access, EC2 malicious IP caller, custom. So all this information has meaning. It refers to the type of attack, the type of service that was hit, things like that. In this case, this EC2 instance right here was just pinging an EIP on the malicious instance. And that EIP is in a custom threat list. So any sort of pinging or any activity from one EC2 instance to the EIP on another EC2 instance, and that EIP is in a custom threat list, will get reported by GuardDuty. Really safe, easy finding to do.
So if there's someone else that hacks into your security to hack that same IP address?
One more time?
If someone hacks your security, do you hack that IP address back?
I would not. No, I would probably inform AWS security if that happened, yeah. So here we have, again, really simple way to simulate an attack here, and we actually have a mitigation that occurred. And what's the best way to do mitigation with GuardDuty? If you're not using your own SIM?
CloudWatch rules?
CloudWatch rules, yes. So a CloudWatch rule within CloudWatch events. And so what we have here is the malicious IP call, EC2 malicious IP call. Okay, so this has 2 targets that it triggers. One is can you guys in the back read that? I hope if I made it bigger. Is that readable? No? Here. How about, I've exceeded the ability to display. How about that? Better? Okay. So there's 2 targets here. Let me scroll up a bit. So here's a really basic way to do the CloudWatch event rule. I mentioned that the JSON that CloudWatch event gets has that full list that I showed you when we did the export. So a lot of things that you can filter on. I'm filtering on just one thing, the type of attack, that unauthorized EC2 malicious IP caller. And when that gets triggered or fired, it triggers 2 targets. One is an SNS topic, so it just sends you an email. And it's doing an input transformation. So what it's doing is it's just grabbing the instance ID, and it's giving you kind of a user-friendly display saying this instance was possibly compromised. So you can, if you're sending this to a security engineer or something like that, you don't have to send them the big JSON file. You can filter this through a transformation and give them a nice friendly message. And then tell them, and you do a link in there saying, go check out the GuardDuty console for more details. The other thing this is doing is a Lambda function to take some kind of action. What could you do here? We have a possibly compromised instance.
Terminate it.
Terminate it. What if this is a production environment?
Not terminate.
What else could you do? Depends. Yeah, I mean, most people are going to inform their security teams.
Create an AMI so you can have like a snapshot of what it looks like, and then terminate it, bring up another instance in that auto-scaling group.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends on what kind of instance this is. Depends on the type of account it is. Most likely you want to have your security team take a look at it. You might have a timer If a certain amount of time has passed, you may want to take action automatically, depending on the situation, depending on the attack, depending on the account. What this does is it actually removes the instance from its current security group and adds it to a security group with no ingress or egress rules. So the application on the instance isn't impacted, but it has no ability to be contacted or contact anything outside. So it's a good start. You wouldn't want to do this to a production server as the first step, but it's an interesting way of kind of handling it. Relatively simple Lambda function. Again, GuardDuty only reports. If you want to take action, it's either in your SIM as some process or CloudWatch events and a Lambda function or something like that.
So right here.
Yeah.
So once GuardDuty's trained and it's months after you think, how long does it take to report from incident to
It'll report literally 5-10 minutes from the time you turn it on for some findings. For the ones that require baseline, that's about 7 to 14 days. But those SSH brute force attacks showed up 15 minutes or so after I turned GuardDuty on for the first time.
So from the threat to when the event gets raised, is it like a couple of seconds? Or are we talking about?
So from the actual threat to the time you see the GuardDuty finding, it can range around 15 minutes or so. Some can take a little bit longer, but most are about 15 minutes. Some will be quicker, but I would say 15 minutes is a good average. You know, a lot of log files that we're going through, and there's a lot of customers, but we're getting better at that, and it'll get better over time. All right, so that Lambda function triggers. Let me just show you the console for EC2, just to prove that. So here's those running instances I mentioned. And we have the compromised instance, the malicious instance that has that EIP, and another compromised instance. And if I find the right compromised instance, then you can see this has been added to this group called Forensic Security Group, which has no ingress or egress rules, and just totally isolates that instance. All right, some other findings that are interesting. API get user was invoked from an IP address on the custom threat list. So here's what happens. So that malicious IP, that EIP is in a custom threat list. Any API calls coming from that instance are going to get flagged. So the idea here is if it's seeing API calls from an IP address that's in some malicious list, one of our threat lists, one of our own or one of yours, that's unusual. And so we're going to report on this. And so this was just a get user call. You can see the region, severity. There's 3 severities, low, medium, and high. You can see the access key ID and other information. So given that we get the access key ID and the principal ID, what could we do here as far as some sort of remediation? Yeah, disable the key. Or at least alert that person or do something that gets eyes on that key. Reconnaissance. This is a list tables and a create user. I won't do this here because of time, but another interesting finding that you can do with this confirmation template is, anyone familiar with IAM roles for EC2? So, you know, it creates temporary keys. If you took those temporary keys and copied them to your laptop and made a call, that would be a pretty unusual activity. It would indicate someone has actually copied keys from one instance that has those temp keys to another one outside of the AWS network. That generates actually a high severity finding, and is definitely an indication of a problem. All right, I'm going to kind of drill through a few slides to cover some of the concepts that I didn't talk about as we went through this. I think we're good on that. I think you guys get threat detection at scale. Why is it at scale? Yes, we're doing all the work. Master member accounts. This says, I think, 100. Now you can do 1,000 member accounts. If you go to the documentation for GuardDuty, we list all of the findings, and again, give some pretty good detail on them. We're going to be adding more very soon, in fact, probably the middle of this month. This is just sort of a brief overview of all of them, but you can see there's three main categories, and this was the question I asked earlier. Three main categories are reconnaissance, and that could be both IAM and EC2, compromised instances, and compromised accounts. Those are kind of the main categories that it's looking at. I think we got that concept down. Again, there's the main threat list that AWS has kind of curated over time, CrowdStrike and Proofpoint, and you can add your own custom threat lists. And you can even add IPs that are whitelisted. So you can whitelist various IPs in your network if you're doing pen testing yourself so that it doesn't get reported in GuardDuty. And we're going to be making it a lot easier to kind of whitelist various findings and things like that in the console. But right now, you just make a list of all your IPs that you want to whitelist.
And can you make those temporary whitelists?
Yeah, so you can deactivate either a threat list or a whitelist at any time.
Okay.
Yeah, it's basically, it's just a text file in S3 that you're pointing to for GuardDuty. That's all it is. Okay, you've looked at the way the console shows it, and that's basically the way I showed it when I exported it. This is the breakdown of all of the different components in a threat. So it's the threat purpose. Take this example, cryptocurrency, resource type affected, EC2 or IAM, threat family name, Bitcoin tool. We'll have various variants of threats over time that we'll report on. This is threat ID. And the artifact means that a particular service was involved, DNS. So this is just an EC2 instance was making a DNS query for a Bitcoin domain. These are the main findings: backdoor behavior, where you need to set up kind of a baseline cryptocurrency, pen testing, recon against EC2 and IAM, any kind of stealth. The example I gave you before was using DNS for data exfiltration, Trojans, detection of the Trojans on EC2, and then, of course, unauthorized access. I'll give you findings, low, medium, high. I think we get that. The findings tell you how important it is, and how much you should worry. The service is in every region, every commercial region, except China and Paris, but it will be in every commercial region soon, and then new regions as we add more over time.
Is there any coverage in Russia?
We don't have any regions in Russia yet, and I haven't heard of any plans, but I'm sure eventually we will. It's a difficult country to get going in right now. Pricing.
Think of all the modeling data you can get in the corner.
So this is one of the better stories, I think, of a service that we've launched. Because it's difficult to know the volume of VPC flow logs that you have, especially if you have a lot of VPCs and you never turn it on, it can be difficult to estimate the price. But we do give you a pricing estimation here. It gives you the actual price per gigabyte for VPC flow log and DNS log analysis. But how are you going to know your amount of DNS logs, because you don't actually have visibility into those? And then 1 million events per month for CloudTrail. But here's a good thing. For the first 30 days of the usage, it's at no cost. And then there's a details screen which shows you the average estimated daily cost for that month, and the volume of VPC flow logs, DNS logs, and CloudTrail logs. So you'll know after 30 days roughly what it's going to cost you. I will say that in general, we've seen the cost at about 1% of the account spend. And we don't see this product as really a replacement for a lot of IDS out there, really any IDS. We see it as an add-on. And a lot of the customers we talk to see it that way. I will say, though, that it does something that a lot of solutions don't do well, and that's detecting the use of stolen access keys. Not a lot of solutions now that do that well. This does this very well. We'll be adding a lot more findings over time. But we want to be clear, this is not a replacement. This is an add-on solution, and it's priced to be that way. Lots of partners, so if you are currently using a SIM solution, it's very possible your solution like Splunk already has this stuff built in for a dashboard and the ingestion of the logs. I think with Splunk, you just use SNS from CloudWatch events to send the logs to Splunk, and then it gives you a dashboard for the analysis. Real quick, I showed you one way to generate findings using an EIP and a custom threat list. You can do an nmap-pn from one EC2 instance to an EIP of another instance in the same VPC, and AWS abuse will not come after you. You can do that all day long, and that will generate findings. And let's look up to this Bitcoin domain. We'll generate a Bitcoin finding. And then adding an EIP on the EC2 instance to a threat list and making an API call, like I showed you before, that'll generate findings. So 3 really easy ways to generate different findings. This is a little out of date, but someone asked earlier about the relationship between Macie, GuardDuty, and Spectre. What's that? Okay. Macie covers S3 buckets and CloudTrail, and by extension, the API endpoints in the IAM. GuardDuty covers DNS logs, VPC flow logs, and CloudTrail, by extension, the API endpoints in the IAM. And Spectre, off by itself, looks directly at the EC2 instances. That's how these 3 kind of connect and interact. So again, there is some overlap, like we discussed, between Macie and GuardDuty, but they really at the heart are going after different things. Data for Macie, network and IAM activity for GuardDuty. And that's it. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you give an example of a threat that would take 7 days or 14 days to baseline?
Yeah, so the amount of data coming out of an EC2 instance, port activity, different ports that instances are talking to, instant launches. So it looks at, and some of this is machine learning and the analysis, it looks at the instances that were launched over time, and all of a sudden after the baseline is done, it sees 100 G2s or GPU instances launched. It could report on that. Not saying it would, that's an example of something it could report on. Those are the main ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
The diagram, did you come up with the diagram by yourself, or was it copied from someone?
Yeah, and I'm kind of tweaking it, but I'm happy to share it in its current rough state. Anything else here?
Would it detect, like, so let's say we only use like 2 AWS regions, and then an attacker like launched an EC2 instance and whatever, one of the other regions? Would that likely come up as a finding, or?
It's region specific for the most part. There are some IAM calls that could be registered, multiple ones, but for the most part it's region specific. But the thing is, if you're not using a region, there's no reason to not turn it on because the cost will be almost nothing. And yet you'll still get alerts that you can then shove into your SIM and have a good centralized view of all your regions. In fact, I would say those regions are very important to watch for because you don't usually watch for them, and something could be going on.
Yes. Why is the pricing different from region to region? Is there a reason for that?
All of our prices differ from region to region, except for, say, like US West 2 and then the 2 US East regions have about the same pricing. But SFO is, or US West 1 is more expensive because it's in a more expensive area. Tokyo is more expensive, so it depends on where they are. That can raise the prices a bit. But every region, for the most part, except for those 3 I mentioned in the US, vary their pricing a bit for every service. Yeah. Yes?
Testing across instances over peering, VPC peering, would that trigger an alert?
What kind of testing?
Abuse, like the...
So the Nmap?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you, yeah, because that would be going across VPCs. Within a VPC, I shouldn't say this. Within a VPC, the AWS abuse team is not looking at that very heavily. It's when you go across VPCs and they're very concerned. So going across VPC peering means you are going across VPCs and they would detect that. If you're doing like an Nmap. Yeah, and you would get an AWS abuse email. Yeah, so there's a number of partners that have already, and this is actually an old list, but there's been a lot more, that add additional functionality. And in fact, recent service launches, the GuardDuty team got in really early with working with these partners. And so, some of them offer solutions that give you a better dashboard for viewing them. Some of them offer solutions for remediating. Some of them are just SIMs, and they have add-ins to pull the data in and do analysis, things like that. Yeah, but lots of partners, and if you just go to the GuardDuty partners, you can see the full up-to-date list. Yeah. I think you were first, sorry.
So is there a limit to the number of flow logs that GuardDuty can monitor, let's say per account?
There's a limit to everything. My guess is there is a limit to that. I don't know what it is. I imagine it's very high. I think I'll ask the team that. That's a good question. Can we get questions or answers back to this group? Is there a way to do that?
If you have questions that weren't answered, can you post them on the meetup, and then you'll be able to
I'll do that, yeah. I'll get that answer, because that's interesting. There's a limit to everything in AWS, as you probably know. There must be some limit there.
Yeah, my thought is, rather than set up a VPC flow log, do one at the ENI or subnet level, so you're not watching everything.
Well, so it doesn't matter what you do in your account when it comes to VPC flow logs. We're looking at every VPC flow log for every VPC in your account. Yeah.
Are the VPC flow logs for the VPC and its communication with the outside world, or is it all the communication within the VPC itself also?
Both.
Okay.
So it's the communication within the VPC and the communication in and out.
Okay.
And it's just the flow, the communication. You're not getting layer 7 or anything. It's a lot of information.
Okay.
You mentioned the keys, like if you took it, I'm actually doing a talk on this. I was wondering if that would work to take the key outside of Amazon to use it for the instance. If you only have a certain time. You said that would be blocked, but what if you're inside Amazon? Is it tied to that instance, or if you took it to another instance?
Do you mean the temp keys from an IAM
Yeah.
role? So only if you took those keys and ran it from a machine outside of the AWS network would we report on it.
Inside it would still work.
Inside it would not report. And both of them, it would still work either way, because GuardDuty doesn't block anything.
Right.
It just reports. But you'd have to run it from your laptop off the AWS network for it to actually report that finding. Now, if I added my IP address of my laptop to a custom threat list and made API calls with my own keys, that would generate findings.
I've seen it like red team and fantastic. I was wondering if that would work seamlessly.
Yeah. There's some things you can do there, but
Well, then why wouldn't you report on that? Who's going to give you an IAM instance to go out and sign that specific instance?
yeah. So
So those 10 keys shouldn't be used anywhere besides that specific instance.
I agree. It's not something they're reporting on right now. Each finding, and if you read them in the documentation, they're very specific in what they look for. But they're adjusting things over time as they get feedback from customers. And I've actually heard that before from other customers. Why wouldn't you be worried about that?
Yeah.
And they'll be adjusting things like that as they get feedback.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does Amazon operate when they operate in other countries, is there a list that you have for those?
Yeah. So we have, if you just do a search on AWS Global Regions, it's a map of the 16 regions we currently have, and then the ones that are planned for the future. But yeah, we have a global coverage. Anything else? Cool. And if you guys have any other questions, you can post it on the thing, and I'll take a look. Cool. All right, that's it.